of weeks, we've been tracing the development from 19th into 20th century empiricism of the positivist movement with its insistence that all knowledge claims must meet the standards of what is supposedly empirical science. And in a real way, this crests in logical positivism. We've commented about some of the things which led to the demise of logical positivism. And one of them was the rise of ordinary language philosophy as distinct from ideal language philosophy. That is to say, the ideal for Russell and some at least of the positivists was to couch our knowledge in language that is free from all loose connotations, because the symbols are defined with reference to explicit empirical points, and to show the interrelationships in terms of formal logical inference. And so the use of symbolic logic was the sort of ideal language of a formal logical sort. Well, that, as I say, led into the logical positivist movement, and the ordinary language movement, the later Wittgenstein and others we'll be talking about today, reacted against that, insisting that ideal language is far too reductionist. You remember Quine objected to the reductionism. It's far too reductionist. The fact is that language in its ordinary usage performs many different kinds of tasks, not just the analytic and descriptive of empirical data tasks. And so the appeal then is to the much greater variety of language uses. Now, at first, that's not an easy notion to get a hold of. So I think it might help if we start with a particular example, namely the debate over religious language, which we can get into through the unfinished part of our agenda in Ayer's Language, Truth and Logic, where you recall last time in commenting on Chapter 6, Ethics and Theology, we succeeded in talking about his treatment of ethics, but not his treatment of theology. Well, it's a very straightforward account that he gives, and you can sum it up as follows, if you like. That in view of the verifiability criterion for meaning, for factual meaning, the proposition that God exists is not factually meaningful, because it's not empirically verifiable directly or in principle. God is not a sense object. In fact, the term God is a metaphysical term, meaningless, because it has no empirical reference. There is, therefore, no factual meaning to any talk about God. So all theological language about God, all theological language is devoid of factual meaning. Now, the consequence is not that he is an atheist or an agnostic. The consequence is that theism, atheism, and agnosticism are all equally meaningless. They don't assert anything. That is to say, anything that's factually meaningful. The consequence is that there is no logical conflict, really, between religion and science. Because science asserts things, but religion doesn't. So how can there be any conflict? And the outcome is that religious experience can provide no evidence. Because religious experience is talking about psychological states, language about religious experience, talking about psychological states, which can be empirically described, but talk about experience as such does not give us empirical reference to God. And he talks about the way in which the mystic in classic ways has talked of God as inscrutable, indescribable. We can only speak of God by way of negation. So no factually meaningful theological language. Now, that was Ayer's account, and it was sort of reiterated in 1944 in an article by John Wisdom called simply Gods. It appeared in one of the British journals, the Proceedings of the Aristotelian Society, in which he said that discussion of God, gods, that sort of language, is more dealing with people's feelings than with facts. More with feelings than with facts. Has no empirical reference. Now, it was John Wisdom's article which therefore triggered a discussion that has become quite famous. I believe it was originally on BBC, and the pieces have been printed and reprinted again and again. You find them in all sorts of philosophy of religion anthologies. But what was involved in this university discussion, or what was being discussed, was the topic theology and falsification. Theology and falsification. And you can see, obviously, the empiricist criterion of meaning that underlies this. Now, there were three people involved in the discussion. One was Anthony Flew, and I've put their names on the board so that you can catch them. One was Anthony Flew, who, in order to try and make sense of the way in which a believer talks of God to a skeptic, told a parable of an invisible gardener. An invisible gardener. That is to say, some explorers come across an area where there is a piece of land surrounded by a wall or a fence or something like that, and is plainly being cared for. It's cultivated. It's been weeded. It's been, in a word, gardened. And so they want to see who it is who's doing this. And they can't find anybody. They hang around and nobody appears. And so they start talking to themselves about an invisible gardener. This is the explanation they come up with. Now, in terms of verifiability, falsifiability, what are you going to say? How could you falsify the existence of an invisible gardener with empirical data? Just not possible. Well, so it is the way in which believers talk about God's care and God's love. So that everything that's involved in the picture of providence and grace and God's activity could be encompassed in this sort of a story. It's not empirically verifiable, but lo and behold, those explorers find it very, very meaningful discussion. The second participant was R.M. Hare. R.M. Hare. And he comes closer to the wisdom's emphasis on religious discussion as simply expression of feeling, perhaps existential feeling, but feeling nonetheless. In his story, the story that he tells of an Oxford Don, an Oxford professor, who has a certain blick. Now, a blick is an irrational kind of hang-up. It's something he's convinced of. A feeling he has, in this case, the feeling that somebody is trying to murder him. And that governs all his behavior. He's always watching out. It explains the way in which he behaves. You see, the invisible gardener was an explanation of certain things. But now Hare is talking of the explanation of an individual's behavior. The invisible gardeners were sort of detached observers. But this Oxford Don is very much involved. He cares. This matters to him intensely. There's more of a matter of religious concern here. Now, of course, what he is saying is not an empirically verifiable or falsifiable assertion. So it avoids the, so it is subject to the criticism of the logical positivist, and yet here it is. That doesn't dissuade him. You see, the professor has a blick. Well, the third individual is Basil Mitchell, who was himself a theologian at Oxford. Basil Mitchell, who told another parable, another story of the stranger, the story of the stranger. And keep in mind that this is done in the late 40s, and he's talking about occupied France. Just tell someone of what they're doing and where they get their directions, and the fact that they get their directions, and that they are supplied with necessary military supplies for their underground activities. And they explain that they're doing this because a stranger had come, a stranger who had told them to fight against the evil occupiers, that he would provide them with the means, and that he would come again to achieve the complete victory. And because they believe the stranger, this is the way they behave. Now, obviously, the theologian is talking about the Christ who came and the second advent that is promised that will achieve the complete victory. But the impression created by the stranger's words, promises, deeds, and personality are such that they are completely convinced. So even though their account of the stranger is not amenable to empirical verification or falsification at this juncture, it certainly explains their behavior. So what you have then in these three cases is a story that is told to explain beliefs and behaviors of religious people. A story that is not empirically verifiable, though you might notice that the story about the stranger is amenable in principle to future